Hello and good morning and good afternoon on the other side of the world. And thank you for coming today. And this is again our second joint meeting between IARC and ARC. And we do have a couple of very interesting talks today. And I'll go, I'll introduce the first talk. For our first speaker, we have Donna Hauser from IARC, and her talk will be on vulnerability of Arctic marine mammals to vessel traffic in the Northwest Sea Route. Um, I'll give the floor to Donna.
Great, thank you. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Are you seeing my screen? Somebody give me a thumb up. Okay.
Yes.
Great. Well, yes, good afternoon. And I understand good morning in Japan. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my research with you today. I'm joining you from Fairbanks on the traditional homelands of the Lower Tanana, and I am also research faculty with the International Arctic Research Center. And so today I'll just briefly talk through a paper that I led recently with my co-authors, Kristen Lydra and Harry Stern, both from the University of Washington Polar Science Center. And we were hoping to understand some of the potential risks and vulnerabilities of 80 submarine populations among the 7 marine mammal species that are endemic across the Pan-Arctic. And so let's go ahead. So as I think we all know in this audience, there's been a really profound loss of Arctic sea ice extent and thickness, duration of cover over the past recent decades. And so no longer are we talking about an Arctic sea route or any Arctic sea routes that were experienced by some of the earliest European explorers, like Amundsen, who we see here. He transited the fabled Northwest Passage over a 3-year period. He did that over a century ago aboard a 21-meter wooden sailing ship. But if we fast forward to 2016, we had the first large cruise ship that was over 250 meters and carried over 1,500 passengers and completed the Northwest Passage within just a matter of weeks. In 2019, we also saw a groundbreaking transit of Russia's Northern Sea Route by a 200-meter container ship. And so full transits of each of these sea routes have increased greatly in recent years. And if we look at a period just from 2011 through 2016, we can see a big difference in the numbers as well as the size of the vessels that have transited these 2 sea routes. So more than double the vessels have transited the Northern Sea Route during this 5-year period, 2011 through 2016, than the number of vessels in the Northwest Passage. And those vessels in the Northern Sea Route were large. They were over 20 meters, all of them, in comparison to the Northwest Passage, where the majority of vessels were actually relatively small, less than 20 meters, and those tended to be private small vessels. And so the expansion of large vessels into these Arctic sea routes raises concerns based on a large body of research that's been done at lower latitudes showing some potential conflicts between vessels and marine mammals. And so let's walk through some of those, issues. So marine mammals are animals that rely on sound. They use sound for foraging, for communication, as well as for navigation. And so there are concerns about acoustic disturbance from vessels. There's also the risk of direct mortality or injury that could result from collisions with large vessels. And so this is a picture of a right whale in the Northwest Atlantic. Right whales are the bowhead whale's closest living relative. And so the concerns associated with the sort of endangered right whales and ships translate pretty strongly over to bowheads at least as well. There also could be a shift in behavior or habitat displacement as a concern associated with vessels. And this is an example from beluga whales in the St. Lawrence Seaway in Canada. And really, I think one of the important factors is that ships are relatively novel. So they're a novel risk factor for these 7 Arctic marine mammal species. These are sentinel species, ice adapted, and they're culturally and ecologically critical for Arctic marine ecosystems. And because they have historically not seen a lot of exposure to vessels, again, this represents a pretty novel concern. And so today I'll just walk through some results of a comprehensive recent paper where we were trying to score the vulnerability of 80 submarine populations of all Arctic marine mammals to vessels. And so vulnerability in this case was really measuring the risk of each of these populations to vessel impacts. This is defined as the combined effect of both exposure and sensitivity. And so let me walk through what I mean by exposure and sensitivity next. So first, exposure was measured on a population-specific basis. We used the literature to delineate the geographic range for the month of September for each of these 80 subpopulations. And so we were focusing on the month of September because that generally has the lowest ice extent when we're looking across the Arctic, but it's also expected as a result to provide the easiest access for these vessels that are moving into the region. And so just to give you an example, here is a map with each of the different colors. The shapes are corresponding to the 19 subpopulations of polar bears across the Arctic. And then in grayscale, or the shading is showing you the areas for the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route. And so if we look at the proportion of overlap, the proportion of each of the ranges for each of those populations with the Northern Sea Route, you can see how we translated that directly to an exposure score that ranked 1, 2, or 3. We also looked at sensitivity. That was the second component of vulnerability, and that's accounting for the potential consequences of being exposed to vessels. And so we were considering 7 variables for each of those populations. And again, this was based largely on literature review. We looked at hundreds of different sources and scored each of these components from 1 to 3. And so just to walk you through an example here, this is for one population, the Beaufort Sea beluga whale population. And so here we're scoring the vessel effect components that I mentioned earlier. We also looked at how frequently each population was exposed in recent years. And then we looked at a previous study that was estimating just the susceptibility of each of these species to sea ice loss. And then we also looked at the relative abundance and status of each population from the recent CAF, or Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna assessment. So we could get a mean sensitivity score for each of the populations. And those, again, went into the sensitivity, and exposure were used to estimate vulnerability. And so if we move into the results, I think one of the important first results is that not all populations were actually exposed to the Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route. So only 53% of the Arctic marine mammal populations were exposed. And this figure is showing how sensitivity by exposure is contributing to overall to vulnerability. So each of these different points or symbols is corresponding to a population, and the different shapes correspond to different species. And so if you look at sort of our x-axis here, I think it's pretty interesting to see there's a lot more variability among populations in terms of their exposure than their sensitivity. And so of the 42 populations that were actually exposed, and among those species, we can categorize them by species, and we see that the cetacean or whale populations, which are on the left-hand side of this bottom figure, generally have higher vulnerability overall than the other species, with the exception of a couple of walrus populations. Indeed, if we average across the populations for each of these species, if we look across on a Pan-Arctic basis, overall narwhals had the greatest vulnerability scores. And that's because they have relatively high exposure based on their geographic range in September, where they're in the high Arctic and the Northwest Passage. And then their sort of characteristics of narwhals also make them relatively sensitive to vessels. Um, on the low end, perhaps one surprise when this paper came out, I think, was that polar bears actually overall have the lowest vulnerability scores across the different species. And that's primarily because, well, two things. One, exposure is relatively low in September for polar bears. Polar bears in September are often either on land or they've gone further north with the receding sea ice. And so they're just not located in some of these sea routes in September. I think the other thing is that they're just not as sensitive, particularly in terms of acoustic disturbance. So polar bears don't rely on sound the way that almost all other marine mammals do. So, so that contributed to the lower scores for polar bears. We also mapped the maximum vulnerability scores across the Arctic and by taxa as well. And so again, you can see that there's variability among species, but also among different regions. So some areas really pop out, areas like Bering Strait and Lancaster Sound. These are sort of natural geographic pinch points just based on the geography. And so characterized by populations that have 2 to 3 times higher vulnerability than more remote regions. And perhaps that's not that surprising. I mean, these are areas that are obligate pathways for both vessels and the migratory marine mammal species that are moving in and out of these regions on a seasonal basis. Okay, and then since we're in Alaska, I just wanted to talk a little more specifically about the Alaskan Arctic and which Alaskan populations were found to be most vulnerable. And so that was the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort Sea population of bowhead whales. 58% of their September geographic range overlapped with actually both the Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route, since they go through Bering Strait region. So that gave them a relatively high exposure score. And then a number of those factors I discussed earlier also make them relatively sensitive. So overall had a relatively high vulnerability score and the highest in the Alaska region. Okay, and then we also took some measurements of uncertainty. So uncertainty scores took into consideration how much information we had available for delineating their geographic ranges, as well as several of the aspects about sensitivity to vessels and population demographics. So when we map these characteristics out across the Arctic, we can again see that there's variations in which regions have the greatest uncertainty. So for example, the Russian Arctic really stands out as an area where we generally have relatively high uncertainty, not as great information for delineating ranges in particular for species and status of a lot of the populations. You can also see that cetaceans, the whales, stand out as characterized as relatively lower uncertainty than the pinnipeds, the seals and the walruses, as well as the polar bears. And so if we talk about that a little bit more, I mean, in general, Arctic marine mammals are relatively data limited species. But among those, certain species like ringed seals and bearded seals, for example, still had greater uncertainty than many of the other species. And for these species, data gaps include things like poor distribution information when we're thinking about how their exposure estimation. But we were also lacking quite a bit of information about population trends and status for many of these species. And then on top of that, there's also relatively few studies that consider vessel sensitivity for seal species relative to at least some work that's been done for Arctic cetaceans and their acoustic responses, which I think maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that in the next talk too. Okay, so I just have a couple more slides here. In conclusion, I think one of the key things to remember is that this is really meant to be a first step, a comprehensive assessment to give us a sense of sort of understanding this heterogeneity of risk to vessels in an Arctic that is and will be increasingly navigable. And so I hope that this can be useful as developing some guidelines for best practices when it comes for maritime industries that are poised to advance into the Arctic. But of course, there's still a lot to do, and this was really just a first step. I would recommend that we really need some detailed case studies for key regions and for key species to be informative and directing sort of future planning for vessels in the region. We also focused just on these 2 sea routes, and that was tractable when we were doing this Pan-Arctic assessment, but that also meant that we left out some regions that aren't part of those 2 sea routes. So for example, Svalbard or some portions of Russia, where we know that there's already been a lot of vessel traffic. And so we've also looked specifically just at September. And so as the open water season continues to expand, I think it's also really important to consider other seasons beyond this fall time. We were also challenged at the time to obtain recent and openly accessible data on the numbers of vessels, the types of vessels, where those vessels were. And I think that's a really critical need for these types of assessment work. Since we published the study, I think there's sort of increasing access to existing data, and we should continue to look into key areas. Certainly the Bering Strait region for the Pacific Arctic is an area that needs much more detailed research. And so I'll just end by noting that, you know, we're at this point where we have the opportunity for some proactive management as we look at this novel risk factor as vessels. And in particular, we can start by looking at lower latitudes about potential vessel management guidelines. And in the Bering Sea region, there have been some recent voluntary routing guidelines, and it would be interesting to look at how well those are being followed and what kind of how well those are doing. So with that, I will just gratefully acknowledge that this work was funded in particular by a NASA Climate Indicators grant, as well as some additional funding at the time from the Collaborative Alaskan Arctic Studies Program from the North Slope Borough. And I've got my email there. I would be happy to answer questions by email, or if we have time to take some questions now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Donna, for a very interesting talk. And I think we have a couple questions on the chat box. Could you, do you see them? Could you please?
Okay. So let's see. Are there any research assessing the impacts of acoustic sonar used by Navy on marine mammal populations in the Arctic? So just to answer that question first, that's a great question. And I am unaware off the top of my head of anything in the Arctic specifically, although I think that that's an area where there might be some work coming up in like the Iceland region, but I'm not the best person to answer that question because I'm not really following the work on sonar. But that might be a good question to follow up with our next speaker who's doing a little bit more acoustic work perhaps. But in terms of the impacts, the significance of these impacts, that's a great question too. And it's a body, I mean, so for that, I would very much look to the lower latitudes where there has been some work. I think that the concerns with sonar activities in particular have largely been focused on sort of the deep diving cetacean, the whale species, deep diving whale species. We do have some deep diving whales in the Arctic, you know, surprisingly deep dives by species like narwhals and belugas. And I would assume that we would have sort of more sensitivity by the cetaceans than the pinnipeds, the seal species, but that's just kind of off the top of my head and a bit of speculation. Okay, so I see another question. What statistical tests did you use to quantify the uncertainties in making the species vulnerability estimates? So we were not doing a lot of like high-tech statistics in this case. We were actually just doing a lot of summary statistics. So that's all in our paper, but largely, you know, because we were using these scoring systems that were pretty simple, you know, ranging 1 to 3, we sort of followed the same sort of approach with our uncertainty estimates as well, and largely was sort of a subjective, although we tracked, you know, what we were measuring for each score, but yeah, those were done on an individual basis. I see another one. I wonder, do marine mammals tend to use leads that are formed for vessel navigation? That's also an interesting question. And I don't know of a lot of in situ work that's been done to like sort of measure how marine mammal, that's actually measured that and reported this. I don't know of any published study with that information. Yeah, I mean, so as these whale species are moving, as they're migrating, certainly they're following open leads. And so it would be interesting to know if they're following open leads that maybe are formed by vessels. That could be interesting. With the case of pinnipeds and icebreakers in particular, that's an area that there's been a little bit of work done in, I think, the Caspian Sea and in the Russian Arctic, looking at pinnipeds during spring and winter. And that's a time where it's actually really interesting to think about how something like icebreaker use might be affecting marine mammals. So for those ice breeding seals, ice breaking activities could actually separate mothers and pups. There's been a little bit of research to show that. And so that would be a really interesting thing to kind of look at a little bit more detailed and think about vulnerability as well. So again, something that we couldn't really consider in our sort of broad scale brush in this case, because we were looking in the fall time. Okay. And then I also see a question about consulting with local subsistence hunters for this. And in this case, no, there was no direct consultation, although this work has been shared broadly, sort of as one-page summaries to go to many tribal governments, at least, especially in Alaska. It's also been distributed across the Canadian Arctic to communities right at the same time as when some of the publication was coming out. But this was very much a broad brush. What is the sort of ecological issues and approaches to understanding vulnerability? And I think a very important next step, and something I would be very interested in working with communities on, is identifying what are the questions and concerns that are driven locally by each community, and how can we start addressing them with more information. For example, now there are opportunities to work with actual vessel tracking data. So, ship transponder data that can get at the types of vessels, the numbers of vessels, when vessels are where, and can more directly address some of the questions that I think might really affect communities, local communities. Okay. And then I see, should I keep going, Irene?
We still have
short on time?
Sorry, yeah. We can have the last two questions. If you would answer them briefly, I guess we can go through them. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I see from Hayo, and talking about how the study focused on the summer fall season, which is correct. And we are expected to see more traffic in winter months. And so I think this assessment would actually change quite a bit for winter months. I already identified some issues, especially with pinnipeds. And so I think the exposure would be much greater for pinnipeds. It might be lower for cetaceans because cetaceans might be in more subarctic regions. They're migrating out of the high Arctic, or at least historically they were. So that I think it's like a whole nother set of results that you would expect from the winter than from the period that we looked at. And then it looks like one more question, the areas to be avoided. Do I think they're the best approach? Oh gosh, that's a great question for mitigating impacts on marine biodiversity. I think that actually should really depend on local governments, local communities, tribal governments. It should depend more sort of on what's happening in a given region. It's really hard to put sort of areas to be avoided on a broad scale, because sometimes some of those areas really depend on the season as well. So I think that that's one thing to look at, but it definitely depends in each region. And then I see the follow-up here really briefly about food security, and that is absolutely one of the components that that should be considered into the future. So, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Donna, and thanks everyone for the interesting questions. And since we're sort of having short in time, we'll be moving on to the second talk. Our next speaker is Yevgeny Podolsky from the IARC Hokkaido University, and his talk will be on underwater sounds of unicorns and glaciers in Greenland. So we'll be focusing on Greenland for his talk. Okay, please.
Uh, Thank you, Irene. I hope you can see my slides right now. Please let me know if you can.
Yes.
Yeah, it's fine. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. This is an excellent opportunity after you got all this background from Donna. So I would just go more local with my talk. So you probably have heard that 400 years ago, scientific literature was a bit confusing, suggesting that this amazing twisted horn, which is actually a tooth, is coming from unicorn. And now we know that it's coming from narvels, and their main habitat is around Baffin Bay between Canada and Greenland, and it extends also up to Novaya Zemlya in Russia and further west. And here, if you look at the coast of Greenland, at the north, there is a Inglefield-Bredning Fjord, which is a part of which is shown here. And it is estimated that every summer it is visited by more than 8,000 narvels for breeding. And we still do not understand well what is really attracting them here to this extremely noisy environment where ice meets water and calves in this catastrophic calving event. So we want to learn more about this home for narvels and study glaciers and animals at the same time. So why to study narvels and glacier fjords today? So you now have heard that sea ice and glacier ice is also are on decline, and this means habitat loss for narvels. At the same time, there are some guys who do not like sea ice very much, and you may see more orcas, for example, or killer whales in the Baffin Bay recently, who really like killing narvals. Then there is another source of pressure on narvals produced by local hunting. So it's subsistence hunting. And at the same time, narvals are competing for fish with locals. And finally, we have also anthropogenic noise, the main source of which is associated with seismic air gun surveys in the Arctic, which are now expanding into previously unexplored areas. And this leads to a conclusion which was backed actually by the talk of Donna before me, that narvals are one of the most susceptible Arctic mammals to climate change. And here you are now a very well-informed audience, and you may say, hey, and what about ships? And actually, honestly, I was naive to think that to this pristine, remote area, not far from the North Pole, ships would not come. Because you see here kayakers hunting whales and local Inuit people. And then during our observations in 2019, for the first time in our fjord, we saw this huge cruise ship coming for sightseeing. And in our data, I haven't found it, the signal of this ship yet, but I suspect that it's very hard to see because we are working in a very noisy environment. Look at these icebergs around. And I was surprised to read in literature from Antarctica that acoustic energy released by an iceberg just in 20 minutes is equivalent to 240 super tankers. And I will come back to this a bit later. So what we do here, the first step in 2019 before COVID we made was just to do some basic direct observations and sightings to confirm that we do have here narvels, and we collaborate with local subsistence hunters who are by law required to use kayaks to hunt whales, and they know how to approach in the open water narvels, which who are very shy animals. They flee from motorized boats, and we can approach, identify that this is a narval and this is not beluga, and we can do some simple mapping and conduct hydroacoustic observations, which is basically underwater microphone dipped into water to listen what they're saying. And we can observe from very close distances their vocalizations. And here, for example, you see the clicks. They like to click a lot for echolocation, and the frequency of these emissions are extremely high, more than 20,000 hertz. This is ultrasound. So it means that from far distances, you cannot hear these animals. And I will, and also our ear actually, if you're older than, I don't know, 8 years old, you cannot hear it with your ear very well. Only lower frequency sounds like communication sounds or foraging clicks, bursts, you can hear. So I will show something, maybe you will hear it. Could you hear something by any chance?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so this is what this fjord sounds like. And we did this first reconnaissance attempt to see how our instrumentation works and what we can record from what distances. And then the next step was to do non-supervised observations in a previously not really explored area of Greenland, very close to the calving front of a tidewater glacier. And here you see ice cliff, which is just 10% above the water. The rest is underwater. And we drop here an ocean bottom seismometer, which is sitting on the floor at the depth of more than 200 meters at very cold temperature. And it has a seismometer, a hydrophone, and a thermometer to listen to the sounds of this place. And why do we do this? So this is a cartoon showing that if you're sitting here, you're safe from these monster icebergs floating above. And at the same time, you record an incredible broad spectra of processes coming from ice, like calving, cracks, and icebergs rubbing, and from animals like pinnipeds, narvels. Even Arctic cod is making sounds, which we can record. And also, of course, humans who are coming here. And if we look at the animals who are vocalizing in the Greenland waters, you may see that we have a lot of frequencies from 25 hertz to more than 150,000 hertz produced by narvels and belugas. So it's extremely wide range. And at the same time, if we look at all this ice quake related things and ice cracking, it's also a lot of frequency band. So to record it, we combine a seismometer, which records low frequencies, shown by this light gray, and also a hydrophone. So we have a very broad coverage with this instrumentation. So what it records is, so this is just an example of just one day in front of a calving front. So 24 hours of seismicity. So it's crazy, busy, place which reminds a crisis for a seismologist or volcanic eruption going on. So, and the largest events are the calving events. And also, it's not only about nature, as I said, we also record boats. So this is a signal from a boat of a hunter passing nearby, and we can detect it from the frequency. So you see, it's useful for many things. And here I will focus on the largest thing which happened here on this glacier during our observations in 2019. So this is our beautiful calving front, 3 kilometers wide. And this part calved as an iceberg, like it's about a kilometer long. And our ocean bottom seismometer was sitting right under this iceberg. So what this thing recorded, I checked first on local seismic network of seismometers run by international consortium. So it's stations like in American Air Base, in central Greenland, and even in Canada. And we observe a glacial earthquake. So this is a distance from 0 to more than 600 kilometers, and this is time of a seismic record. So from the glacier, this seismic waves produced by calving are traveling to Thule, then to Nîmes, to people who are doing ice cores, and then to Canada. So imagine more than 500 kilometers. And for those of you who are based in Japan, just to put it in perspective, this crazy distance. So Sapporo Sendai, it's 535 kilometers. And for those of you who are based in Alaska, I also checked and I was surprised that the distance from Fairbanks to Seward, for example, is also exactly the same. So this is a serious event. So what about sound? So this is the sound. This is 45 minutes of a sound record produced by our hydrophone attached to this ocean bottom seismometer sitting at the floor of the fjord. This is the spectrograms. It's a very broad signal. And this is the iceberg calving raw record with blue lines showing this kind of cumulative acoustic energy emitted by this event. And then the second part, this is when iceberg disintegrated right overhead above our seismometer, and hydrophone. And then I decompose it to frequencies to show you that it feels such a broad spectra. So it has low frequency component, middle frequency component, and even ultrasound. So ultrasound produced by calving is also pretty amazing. And here, please look at this units. So we have pascals. More than 600 pascals of pressure at distances about like more than 600 meters. So this is a lot because usually ocean acoustics is working with micropascals, 10 to minus 6. So this is a very loud thing. And at the same time here, I make this little zoom here. Right when the calving is starting, we can check that there are narvels in the fjord very close because their sounds are attenuating and you cannot hear them at distances more than a kilometer or 2 kilometers. So, and we see their sounds. This is a whistle. So they're communicating with these whistles. And also this is a click burst, which is probably used for foraging. And then, so how this event sounds, I will try to show you. So this is a noise of an iceberg, which is etching, collapsing, rotating, and this thing lasts for almost 30 minutes. So, and then the question is, of course, was it loud? So comparing to literature, was it loud? And for animals, was it loud for animals? And comparing to literature, it's relatively simple, but then for animals, to answer if it was loud or not for animals is actually very tricky. And there are two things to say if it was loud or not. So it's called PTS criteria, which stands for permanent threshold shift, which basically means if there was a risk of mechanical hearing damage to an animal. And there are two ways to assess it. By looking just at peak pressure, so if your received pressure levels was higher than some threshold, there was the risk of hearing damage. And another criteria is exposure levels, because the sound, it may continue for a long time. So if you're exposed to explosion, or then you're exposed to like 10 explosions, it's a big difference. So exposure levels. And these two things, they are very technical, and they're defined by this National Marine and Fisheries Service document. And you see there are keywords like technical. So I wouldn't go into details to describe how it works. And then this technical guidance is for anthropogenic sounds. But I'm using it because there is no other alternative for natural sounds. And actually also, when you use this criteria, the peak pressure and exposure levels, I compute it, these equations, they don't know which sound you're dealing with. Is it natural or anthropogenic? So I think it applies, and this is what I follow, and to calculate this criteria and see if it was reached during this calving event. Okay, so to do this, we need first to estimate sound source levels. And here, this plot is showing a very basic things, which I will explain now. So we measured at some distance from this source, at 640 meters from this gigantic calving event. So this is our received level, which we then express in decibels. And there are so many ways to express sound in decibels relatively to pressure. So it's very actually tricky. And I use some way to do it consistently for comparing with literature. And then, so what we want to know, what was the source levels at distance of 1 meter, which is a conventional way of estimating source levels. So we want to see how much transmission loss there was, and there is a way to calculate it. So considering geometric loss due to spreading and other things, and there's different models. And I'm showing by red something what I find the most appropriate. So it's kind of the sound is spreading like a sphere away from the calving, and then it hits the fjord's floor and spreads a cylinder away. So we get these levels of all like 234 decibels. And then I want to see how it compares to other things. And the most loudest things I could find in literature reviews for seismic air guns, for Arctic were seismic air guns and underwater blasting. So you see, this is the most loud things you can find. And calving is among them. But if we look at the threshold criteria, so for example, for narvels, which is, well, it's for belugas, but I use it as a proxy. So for narvels and for seals, only within the closest few meters to the source, which is unrealistic, there is a risk. So basically from this peak pressure perspective, there is no risk. But then let's look at another thing, which is called sound exposure levels weighted. And weighted actually corresponds to also consideration that different animals can hear different frequencies, and they're not sensitive to some frequencies. For example, pinnipeds, they don't hear as high frequencies compared to narvels. And then when I do this again, the story repeats somehow. So this was unweighted sound exposure levels. This is for pinnipeds, and this is what we have for narvels. And then we look at the source levels of this sound exposure. And again, compared to air guns, this is so much higher. And this was the threshold defined by the document I presented earlier. So you see in the first few kilometers, the threshold is exceeded, suggesting, surprisingly to me, that the narvels are actually possibly, and pinnipeds as well, are at risk of hearing damage. And what to make out of this, I'm not sure yet, and I'll be happy to hear some thoughts about it. But animals are attracted to these places, so it seems it's worth taking the risk if our calculation is correct. And with that, I also want to mention that the energies involved at the source are incredible. So it's 10 to 10 of joules, and up to, it's equivalent to 6 tons of TNT. And it's also scary to think that only a tiny fraction of kinetic energy is converted to sound. So we are dealing with very powerful things, which are actually, it seems to be normal for animals. And with that, I will finish by saying that we want to continue listening in glacial fjords because it has wide range of applications, and long-term is our next step when all this is over. As you know what should be over to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evgeny, for your talk. And I'll open the floor for questions. You can leave your comments or questions in the chat box, or you can just raise your hand.
Hi, Irene. I have a.
Oh, sure.
I don't know how to raise my hand. Well, like
okay. Okay.
So hi, Jeka. It's been very interesting to know in a little bit more detail what you are doing there. And I was just wondering with this last slide about the exposure. So that kind of assumes that the narwhals and the other mammals are in the fjord all the time, but I guess they can leave the fjord, right? if it's coming towards the threshold that noise is damaging, and it's a long process, which is what exposure, I guess, is measuring. They may just leave the fjord. So I was wondering if it would be interesting to combine what you are doing also with tracking the movements of the, like putting tags or something that allows you to see how they are moving in the fjord.
Oh, this is excellent point. And in this case, I analyze event. So I'm showing this energy computations for event for the most powerful part of event, which lasts less than 3 minutes. So actually to flee very quickly for several kilometers away, that's not so easy when you're already kind of there. So, but yeah, of course, this is one of the key problems in all these estimates, I guess. So how do you deal with animals fleeing away? And there are masters of doing this, but yeah, tagging narvels, it's a very difficult task made by many scholars also in US. And I I can only dream about this, but I'm like an amateur in this business. So at this point, we don't have this ambition to do tagging. But of course, that would be interesting to see how animals are moving because the records for other animals like whales, relatively movement relative to ships, it's shown that it's actually quite important part because they can escape, of course. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question, Jorge. Do we have other questions from the audience? We still have time for questions, and everyone is welcome to ask their question.
Hey, thanks, Evgeny. I actually had more a question about the glaciology then. So what can you tell us a bit about what you're learning about ice dynamics in the fjord from this data? Give us a glimpse of what you'll be able to get out of some of the glaciological component of the project.
Yeah, it's this picture which I was showing before. So we already processed something. So this picture you may see again shows that we are measuring so many things. So glaciologically, we can hear, for example, how fast the glacier is sliding on its bed. So this week we will have a paper coming out showing that from seismic noise of the sliding slab of the Tidewater Glacier, we can say how fast it's moving and see also other things like tide modulated crevasing and breathing of crevices driven by this ocean level oscillation, for example. Additionally to this, just super near source records of glacial earthquakes shaking Greenland regionally. So I think this is kind of one of benefits of having this kind of deployment so close to glacier in a safe place. And without using tons of batteries, which would be required to run this seismometer on the surface when it's -40. So this is kind of example of what we're doing glaciologically.
Just a quick question. You were showing on the diagram earlier that you were also able to identify acoustic coming from cod, Arctic cod.
Not myself. That was a review of all Greenland related species which were reported in literature. So there is a reference to that. So yeah, but yeah,
But yeah, I was.
It's not ours, but it was shown experimental.
So it would be possible to sort of identify um, fish schools, for instance, from the instrument that you have deployed?
Well, from Arctic species, only one fish was shown to produce sound so far. Very little is known. But for tropical seas, there's plenty of literature showing that the species can be classified, but it's possible, but it just, we need to be very close to fish because they make very weak sounds, not like whales and not like icebergs. So it's if the fish is floating very close.
Okay. Okay, so do we have other questions? We still have we can accommodate one more question before we finally close this seminar.
I guess I've got another question more broadly. I mean, sort of looking at the work that you're doing, Evgeny, and others, and sort of reflecting on some of what Donna was talking about. I mean, in terms of impacts of marine sound and noise on marine mammals or other, other fish or other marine wildlife, do you see potential uses of just regularly deployed hydrophones or some of these bottom seismometers to get better insights into how sound is impacting animals, or does that require much more sophisticated, focused measurements that are more in line with, I don't know, sort of the way marine mammals, say, perceive sound? If this type of work is something that can generate useful insights, I'm wondering whether that's an area where one might think about further collaboration, because clearly there's a concern, as Jackie Schaefer pointed out, just from the perspective of increases that are projected in noise in marine environments. Just the Bering Straits region, I don't know how many, some of you of course know this quite well, but the projection is that by, I think 2025, there will be a fleet of on the order of 30 to 40 ice-breaking LNG tankers coming out of Sabeta in Russia, many of them going through Bering Strait. By the end of the 2020s, just looking at the orders that are in now, it's going to be on the order of 60 to 65 vessels. So there will be a very tight schedule of vessels that are breaking ice, making a lot of noise, in particular in the wintertime, where otherwise this would be sort of a different environment. So the question is that an area that's that would lend itself for further collaboration?
Donna, any comments on that? Or I would say that both are very important, because I found that, for example, there is very little of observations about the presence of animals, and actually we know very little how many animals there are. What are they doing, and where are they coming from? Because this population of narvels, for example, in that Greenland fjord I showed, it's not even clear where they winter. So how do you estimate the impacts of something on something if you don't know where actually things are and how many animals there are? So combining acoustic observations, continuous acoustic observations in this dark polar waters under sea ice is helpful, but it should be combined with some sightings, of course. But also experimental work is very important, because I see that, for example, for narvels who are not living in this pools, in aquariums, they are not living like belugas in the pools. So there are no experiments showing what is their sensitivity to sound, actually. And only recently I heard in the news that there are some planned experiments somewhere in East Greenland by some collaboration of US and probably Greenlanders. So there is very little actually experimental evidence what animals are like kind of hearing in the water and how they respond to this. So both things are really poorly kind of explored for some areas, and for narvels who are so vulnerable, actually, it's a very important question. So would it lead to collaboration? I don't know, but it should, I think. So this is what I can say. If Donna can comment, I would be very happy not to be alone with this.
I think it's a really interesting and important question that Hayo has raised. And I think that, yeah, there should be more observing of not just, where animals are and who they are, in different times and seasons, but the seascape, just monitoring the seascape, I think is actually one of the, and the sounds in the seascape. So I think, that Evgeni's presentation really showed us a really nice example of how dynamic the seascape is, and just sort of this like glacially influenced region in Northwest Greenland, right? And that varies a lot. And so, we know that these animals are exposed to really high, loud sounds already, but just the sounds, the natural sounds, but sort of being able to capture trends in anthropogenic sounds, human-made sounds, would be really interesting as well, on top of also learning a little bit more about the biology of the species and the populations. But one of the challenges with acoustics, of course, is that the animals have to be vocalizing, and they have to be in proximity to those hydrophones. And so, so there's some work to be done there too. So I would second that some direct observations is a good thing too. So.
Okay, we're right on time. It's a minute away from 10 o'clock here. And we would like to thank everyone, the speakers especially, for the very engaging talks, and for everybody who came and joined us. So we'll be seeing you during the third meeting, which would be in August. And yeah, hope to seeing everyone again. So I'll be ending the presentation, the meeting now.